Sometimes salvation comes wrapped in the most unexpected bargains, and love arrives through the coldest of transactions. England, 1818. The brass knocker on the door of number 12 Grosvenor Square struck 3 times in rapid succession, each blow echoing through the dim entrance hall of what had once been a respectable London townhouse. Miss Evelyn Carlyle stood alone in the morning room, her fingers trembling slightly as she broke the wax seal on the thick envelope that had just been delivered. The paper was expensive, official, bearing the stamp of Hutchinson and Sons, solicitors at law. She already knew what it would say. She had known for weeks, through the sleepless nights and the mornings when her father could not be roused from his study, surrounded by empty bottles and the detritus of yet another evening spent drowning his sorrows in brandy. Final notice of confiscation, read the bold lettering at the top of the document. Be it known that Carlisle Manor, property of the Earl of Carlisle, shall be seized in satisfaction of debts outstanding in the amount of £4,700. Said seizure to take effect on the 20th day of May, in the year of our Lord 1818, being 60 days from the date hereof. 60 days. 2 months to save everything her mother had loved, everything her younger brother Peter deserved to inherit, everything that represented the Carlisle name before her father had gambled and drunk it all away. Miss Evelyn? The housekeeper, Mrs. Dawson, appeared at the doorway, her lined face creased with concern. Your father is asking for tea, though I suspect that he wants something stronger. Evelyn finished quietly, folding the notice with careful precision. Tell him I shall be up directly. She found the Earl of Carlisle in his study, slumped in the worn leather chair that had belonged to his own father. At 56, he looked far older, his once handsome features ravaged by years of excess. The room reeked of stale alcohol and unwashed linen. Father, Evelyn said, her voice steady despite the rage and despair warring within her chest. We have received final notice. Carlisle Manor will be confiscated in 60 days. Her father waved a dismissive hand. Cannot be helped, girl. The debts are what they are. Your brother will have to make his own way. Good thing he has his studies at Cambridge to fall back upon. Peter is 19 years old, Evelyn replied, setting the notice on the desk with deliberate force. He has no fortune, no prospects beyond what the Carlisle name can provide him, and you are destroying that name with every passing day. The Earl laughed bitterly. Spare me your lectures. Your mother tried the same before she had the good sense to die and escape this misery. Evelyn felt the familiar sting behind her eyes but refused to let the tears fall. She had learned years ago that weeping accomplished nothing. I have an appointment with Mr. Hutchinson this afternoon. Perhaps there is something to be salvaged. Her father merely grunted and reached for the bottle on his desk. The offices of Hutchinson and Sons occupied a respectable building on Fleet Street, its wood-paneled walls lined with legal volumes that spoke of generations of service to London's aristocracy. Mr. Edmund Hutchinson, a portly gentleman with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles, received Evelyn with the sort of gentle courtesy that made her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. Miss Carlyle, he began, once they were settled in his private office. I wish I had better news regarding your family's situation. However, I have reviewed every document, every contract, and I fear the debts are quite legitimate and long overdue. I understand, Evelyn replied, folding her hands in her lap to still their shaking. I came hoping you might suggest some course of action, however desperate. Mr. Hutchinson hesitated, then withdrew a sealed document from his desk drawer. There is one matter I have been authorized to discuss with you, though I confess I had not thought to mention it under these circumstances. Your late maternal grandmother, Lady Thornbury, established a trust in your name some years before her death. Evelyn blinked in surprise. A trust? But why was I never informed? The terms were quite specific, the solicitor explained, opening the document to reveal pages of dense legal text. The principal sum cannot be accessed until you reach the age of 30, or, he paused significantly, until you marry. Hope flared sudden and fierce in Evelyn's chest. How much? £6,000. The sum staggered her. It was more than enough to save Carlisle Manor and still leave a substantial portion for Peter's future. Then I must marry, she said simply. Is there no other condition? Only that the marriage be to a respectable gentleman of good family, as determined by this office," Mr. Hutchinson replied. "Miss Carlyle, I must caution you against any hasty decision." "Hasty?" Evelyn felt laughter bubbling up, sharp and slightly hysterical. "Mr. Hutchinson, I am 26 years old, with no beauty to recommend me, no dowry, and a father who has made our family name synonymous with disgrace. If I am to marry at all, it must be now, and it must serve a purpose beyond romantic fancy." The solicitor studied her with something resembling admiration. "You are remarkably pragmatic, Miss Carlyle. As it happens, I may be able to assist you. There is a gentleman of my acquaintance, the Duke of Hargrave, who finds himself in equally desperate circumstances. His late uncle, who served as his guardian until majority, managed the ducal estates with spectacular incompetence, leaving the current duke with properties mortgaged to their full value and debts that mount daily. And he seeks a wife with capital," Evelyn concluded. "Precisely. His Grace requires a substantial sum immediately to prevent foreclosure on Hargrave Hall. He is prepared to offer marriage to any respectable woman who can provide the necessary funds. I took the liberty of mentioning your situation to him, and he has agreed to meet with you, should you wish to pursue this arrangement." Evelyn drew a deep breath. "When?" "Tomorrow morning, here in my offices, 10 o'clock. That evening, Evelyn sat at her writing desk, composing the most difficult letter she had ever written. "My dearest Peter," she began, "by the time you receive this, much will have changed. I am to be married within the month to the Duke of Hargrave. Please do not be alarmed. This is an arrangement of mutual benefit, nothing more. The marriage will secure your inheritance and ensure your studies at Cambridge continue without interruption. Carlisle Manor will be saved. You need not worry for the future. Your loving sister, Evelyn." She sealed the letter before she could reconsider, before she could acknowledge the sacrifice she was making, the dreams she had long since set aside. The following morning, Evelyn dressed with particular care in her best day gown of deep blue merino wool, her chestnut hair arranged in a simple but elegant style that emphasized her best features. She was not beautiful, she knew, but she had a certain quiet dignity, an air of competence that had served her well in managing her father's declining household. Julian Whitmore, Duke of Hargrave, arrived at Mr. Hutchinson's offices precisely at 10 o'clock. Evelyn heard his footsteps in the corridor outside, measured and authoritative, before the door opened to reveal a man who took her breath away despite her determination to remain unmoved. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with dark hair that fell in waves to his collar and eyes of a piercing blue-gray that seemed to see through every defense she had constructed. His face was all sharp angles and aristocratic planes, handsome in a severe way that spoke of discipline and control. He wore his authority as naturally as his perfectly tailored coat of charcoal wool. "Your Grace," Mr. Hutchinson said, rising to make introductions. "May I present Miss Evelyn Carlyle, daughter of the Earl of Carlisle. Miss Carlyle, His Grace, the Duke of Hargrave." Evelyn rose and curtsied with practiced grace. "Your Grace." Julian bowed slightly, his gaze never leaving her face. "Miss Carlyle, shall we dispense with pleasantries and discuss the matter at hand?" His voice was deep, cultured, and utterly devoid of warmth. Evelyn felt something inside her harden in response. If this was to be a business arrangement, she would treat it as such. "By all means," she replied evenly. They sat across from each other at Mr. Hutchinson's desk, the solicitor serving as intermediary and witness. Julian withdrew a leather portfolio and extracted a single sheet of paper covered in his bold handwriting. "I require £6,000 immediately to prevent foreclosure on my principal estate," he stated without preamble. "In exchange, I offer marriage, my title, and the protection of my name. I will expect you to reside at Hargrave Hall and manage the household to a standard befitting a duchess. Beyond that, I make no demands upon your time or person. We shall maintain separate quarters and separate lives." Evelyn absorbed this coldly practical proposal, then shook her head. "I cannot agree to those terms." Something flickered in Julian's eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or irritation. "I beg your pardon?" £3,000 will go to saving my family's estate, Carlisle Manor," Evelyn said calmly. "The remaining 3,000 is yours. However, I have a condition of my own." Julian leaned back in his chair, studying her with renewed interest. "Which is?" I will manage your properties personally, with full authority over accounts, contracts, and household decisions, until such time as the debts are cleared and the estates are profitable once more. I have spent the past 8 years managing my father's affairs and preventing total ruin. I know precisely what is required. For a long moment, Julian said nothing. Then, to her surprise, the corner of his mouth lifted in something that might have been respect. You drive a hard bargain, Miss Carlyle. I am preserving both our interests, Your Grace. Julian extended his hand across the desk. Very well, we have an agreement. Evelyn placed her hand in his and felt the firm, cool grip of his fingers against her gloved palm. The handshake lasted only a moment, but it sealed a bargain that would alter both their lives irrevocably. The wedding will take place in 3 weeks, Julian said, releasing her hand and returning to his portfolio. Mr. Hutchinson will handle all legal arrangements. I trust that is sufficient time for you to prepare. More than sufficient, Evelyn replied. As Julian departed, striding from the office without a backward glance, Evelyn remained seated, her heart pounding beneath her stays. She had just agreed to marry a man who looked at her as one might evaluate a horse at auction, who spoke of their future together with all the emotion of a business transaction. But Carlyle Manor would be saved. Peter's future would be secure. And she, Evelyn Carlyle, would become a duchess, with authority and purpose beyond anything she had dared imagine in her reduced circumstances. The price was merely her heart, which she had learned long ago to guard behind walls of practicality and resignation. Surely that was a bargain she could live with. The wedding took place on a gray morning in early April, in the small chapel at St. George's, Hanover Square. The ceremony was brief, attended only by Mr. Hutchinson, his clerk who served as witness, and Lady Margaret Whitmore, the Duke's grandmother, a formidable woman of 72 whose sharp eyes missed nothing. Evelyn wore a gown of ivory silk, hastily altered from one of her mother's own wedding garments, and carried no flowers. Julian stood beside her in dark blue superfine, his expression as remote as the clergyman's voice intoning the ancient vows that would bind them together until death. I, Julian Edward Whitmore, take thee, Evelyn Grace Carlyle, to be my wedded wife, he said, his voice steady and utterly devoid of emotion. When it was Evelyn's turn, she forced herself to meet his eyes. I, Evelyn Grace Carlyle, take thee, Julian Edward Whitmore, to be my wedded husband. The ring he slid onto her finger was heavy gold, engraved with the Hargrave crest. It felt foreign against her skin, a symbol of a title she had never imagined bearing. I now pronounce you man and wife, the clergyman concluded. Julian did not kiss her. He merely bowed formally and offered his arm to lead her from the chapel. The journey to Hargrave Hall took the better part of 6 hours in the Duke's traveling carriage. They sat across from each other in silence, the only sound the rhythmic clatter of wheels against the road and the occasional call of the coachman to the horses. Evelyn watched the landscape transform from London's crowded streets to rolling countryside, wondering what awaited her at journey's end. Julian spent most of the ride reviewing documents from a leather case, his attention entirely absorbed. Once their eyes met accidentally, and Evelyn saw something flicker in his gaze before he looked away. Curiosity, perhaps, or assessment. Nothing warmer. Hargrave Hall appeared as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. The approach was magnificent, a tree-lined drive that curved through parkland before revealing the house itself, a sprawling Georgian manor of pale stone with dozens of windows reflecting the dying light. It should have been breathtaking, but Evelyn's practiced eye immediately noted the neglect. Overgrown gardens, crumbling stonework around the fountain, weeds sprouting between the paving stones of the courtyard. Welcome to your new home, Julian said, his first words in hours. A line of servants awaited them on the front steps, arranged in strict hierarchy. At their head stood a woman of middle years with iron-gray hair and a capable demeanor that immediately reminded Evelyn of her own departed housekeeper at Carlyle Manor. Mrs. Price, my housekeeper, Julian introduced curtly. Mrs. Price, the Duchess of Hargrave. The older woman curtsied deeply, her expression carefully neutral. Your Grace, welcome to Hargrave Hall. Thank you, Mrs. Price, Evelyn replied, noting the way the other servants watched this exchange with unveiled interest. Julian led her through the entrance hall, their footsteps echoing on marble floors dulled by years of insufficient polishing. The interior matched the exterior, grand bones obscured by layers of neglect. Dust motes danced in shafts of fading sunlight, and several of the portraits lining the walls hung askew in their frames. "Your chambers are in the east wing," Julian said, guiding her up a sweeping staircase. "Mine are in the west. I trust you will find the arrangement satisfactory." He opened a door to reveal a suite of rooms that must once have been lovely. The sitting room featured pale blue walls and furniture draped in Holland covers. Through an adjoining doorway, Evelyn glimpsed a bedchamber with a four-poster bed and windows overlooking the gardens. "Dinner is at 7, Julian continued in that same detached tone. "However, I often take my meals in my study when attending to estate business. Mrs. Price will see to your needs. If you require anything, you need only ask." "And my duties?" Evelyn asked. "We agreed I would manage the household and review the accounts." For the first time, something resembling respect crossed his features. "Mrs. Price will provide you access to all household records tomorrow. The estate ledgers are in the library. I shall leave instructions that you are to have unrestricted entry." He departed without further ceremony, leaving Evelyn alone in rooms that smelled of disuse and lavender sachets gone stale. That night, she dined alone in the formal dining room, served by silent footmen who watched her with poorly concealed curiosity. The meal was adequate but uninspired, the silver slightly tarnished, the wine decanted into a dusty carafe. Evelyn noted every detail, her mind already cataloging the work ahead. The following morning, she began her investigation. Mrs. Price proved an invaluable ally, her initial wariness melting when she realized the new Duchess actually understood household management. "Forgive me for speaking plainly, Your Grace," the housekeeper said as they toured the still room. "But this house has not had a proper mistress in 15 years, not since the old Duchess passed. The late Lord Pembroke, His Grace's uncle who served as guardian, had no interest in domestic matters. He dismissed half the staff to save money and let everything fall into disrepair." "And the Duke?" Evelyn asked. Mrs. Price's expression grew carefully neutral. "His Grace assumed his title at 21, but by then the damage was done. He has spent these years trying to salvage the estate holdings, but without adequate capital." She trailed off delicately. Over the following days, Evelyn immersed herself in the account books. What she discovered made her blood run cold. The initial financial summary she had seen before the wedding showed significant debts, certainly, but the detailed ledgers revealed systematic embezzlement, fraudulent supplier contracts charging double the market rate, and deliberate mismanagement that suggested Lord Pembroke had been either criminally incompetent or actively malicious. She found Mrs. Price in the servants' hall, reviewing the week's menu. "We need to speak privately." In the housekeeper's small office, Evelyn spread the ledgers across the desk. "These contracts with the chandler, the wine merchant, the coal supplier, they are all excessive, grossly so." Mrs. Price studied the figures, her lips thinning. "Mr. Thornby, His Grace's steward, arranged all those agreements. He was Lord Pembroke's man. Where is Mr. Thornby now?" "Still employed, Your Grace. He maintains an office in the estate building near the stables." Evelyn closed the ledger with deliberate care. Not for much longer. That afternoon she confronted the steward, a florid man with calculating eyes who clearly had not expected his new mistress to understand accounts. When she presented evidence of his fraudulent contracts, he blubbered excuses. "You will gather your belongings and depart Hargrave Hall by sunset," Evelyn said quietly. "Be grateful I am not pursuing criminal charges." News of the steward's dismissal spread rapidly through the household. Evelyn sensed the shift in how the servants regarded her, a mixture of respect and apprehension. She had shown she possessed both knowledge and authority. Julian returned from inspecting the northern farms 3 days after their arrival. He found Evelyn in the library, surrounded by ledgers and correspondence. "I understand you dismiss Thornby," he said without preamble. Evelyn rose, meeting his gaze steadily. "He was stealing from you. These contracts alone represent an excess expenditure of nearly £800 annually." Julian crossed to the desk, examining the evidence she had laid out. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, "You move quickly, Duchess." "We have no time to waste," Evelyn replied. "The situation is far worse than the summary suggested. Your uncle did not merely mismanage the estates, he deliberately sabotaged them. Something dark crossed Julian's features. I suspected as much. He never forgave my father for inheriting the title when he believed it should have been his. It was the most personal thing he had said to her since their wedding. Evelyn felt an unexpected stirring of sympathy. There is another matter, she continued. Several tenant families are ill. The cottages are damp and poorly maintained. I believe it is contributing to respiratory ailments. Julian's expression shuddered. The repairs would be costly. More costly than losing productive tenants? Evelyn challenged. These are not livestock, Your Grace. They are people who depend upon us. I am well aware of my responsibilities, he said coldly. Then fulfill them, Evelyn countered, surprising herself with her boldness. You gave me authority to manage these affairs. I am telling you, repairs are necessary. They stood facing each other across the desk, tension crackling between them. Finally, Julian inclined his head stiffly. Very well. I shall provide the funds, but I expect detailed accounting of all expenditures. Of course, Evelyn replied. As he turned to leave, a footman appeared at the library door. Your Grace, Lord Edmund Fairmont has arrived and requests accommodation. Julian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Show him to the blue guest chamber. We shall receive him for dinner. After the footman departed, Evelyn asked, Lord Edmund. My cousin, Julian replied curtly. My heir, should I die without issue. That evening, Evelyn met Edmund Fairmont in the drawing room before dinner. He was handsome in a practiced way, with fair hair and pale blue eyes that assessed her with unconcealed curiosity. My dear cousin, he said, bowing over her hand with exaggerated courtesy. What a delightful surprise to find Julian has finally married. And so quickly. The wedding was quite private, I understand. Circumstances required expediency, Julian said, entering the room with his usual commanding presence. Throughout dinner, Edmund made pointed comments wrapped in false pleasantness. Such a practical arrangement, I imagine. Julian needed capital, and you, my dear Duchess, gained a title. Very sensible, very modern. Evelyn felt Julian's tension from across the table. I assure you, Lord Edmund, our marriage is as valid as any. Oh, I meant no offense, Edmund replied smoothly. I merely observe that Julian has always been practical in his approach to duty, unlike some who might marry for sentiment. My wife's capabilities speak for themselves, Julian said, his voice carrying an edge. She has already identified significant improvements to the estate management. Edmund's smile dimmed fractionally. How industrious. Later, as Evelyn retired to her chambers, she heard Edmund's voice drifting from Julian's study. Though she could not make out words, the tone suggested argument. She wondered what grievance lay between the cousins, what history shadowed their interactions. In her room, she found a letter had been delivered during dinner. The familiar handwriting made her throat tighten. Dearest Evelyn, Peter had written. Your letter reached me yesterday, and I confess I hardly know what to think. A duchess, my sister, who used to climb trees with me and steal tarts from the kitchen. But I understand why you did it, and I am grateful beyond words. Carlisle Manor is saved, and my future secured. I only hope this Duke of yours appreciates what a treasure he has gained, even if it was through necessity rather than choice. I shall write often. Your loving brother, Peter. Evelyn pressed the letter to her chest, allowing herself a moment of vulnerability in the privacy of her chamber. She had gained a title and a purpose, yes, but she had also entered a cold marriage with a man who regarded her as a business arrangement, nothing more. Through the window, she could see candlelight in the west wing where Julian's chambers lay. So near, and yet impossibly distant. It would have to be enough. 3 months had passed since Evelyn's arrival at Hargrave Hall, and the changes were beginning to show. The gardens no longer resembled a wilderness. The silver gleamed on the sideboard, and the tenant cottages boasted new roofs that no longer leaked when rain fell. The household accounts, once a labyrinth of fraud and incompetence, now balanced with satisfying precision. Evelyn stood at her writing desk each morning, composing letters to Peter that detailed her progress. His responses arrived with gratifying regularity, filled with news of his studies at Cambridge and updates on Carlisle Manor's restoration. The administrator she had hired proved capable, and Peter wrote enthusiastically about visiting during the summer holiday to assume some responsibilities himself. "Your Duke sounds formidable," Peter had written in his latest letter, "though I suspect he has met his match in you, dear sister. Mother would be proud of what you've accomplished." Julian remained as distant as ever, despite their forced proximity. They took breakfast separately, dined together only when social obligation demanded, and passed in corridors with polite nods that acknowledged nothing beyond their formal arrangement. Yet Evelyn found herself noticing small things: the way he rubbed his temple when reviewing particularly troubling correspondence, the slight softening of his expression when he spoke with his elderly tenants, the exhaustion that shadowed his eyes after long days inspecting the far reaches of the estate. It was during one such inspection that disaster struck. The storm had rolled in from the north with little warning, transforming a gray afternoon into a deluge of biblical proportions. Julian had departed that morning to examine drainage issues on the western farms, promising to return by dinner. When darkness fell and he had not appeared, Evelyn felt the first stirrings of genuine concern. He finally arrived near midnight, soaked through and shivering, supported between two grooms who had found him collapsed near the stables. Water streamed from his clothing, and his face bore an alarming flush despite the violent tremors racking his frame. "Get him to his chambers immediately," Evelyn commanded, her voice cutting through the chaos of alarmed servants. "Mrs. Price, send for Dr. Morrison at once. Have fires built up in his Grace's rooms and prepare hot water." She followed the grooms up the stairs to the west wing, propriety forgotten in the face of Julian's obvious distress. His bedchamber was cold and dark, the fire long since died to embers. While the servants scrambled to rectify this, Evelyn began stripping away Julian's sodden coat and waistcoat, her fingers struggling with buttons made stiff by rain and cold. "Your Grace, this is hardly proper," Mrs. Price protested weakly, appearing with an armful of linens. "Propriety will not save him from pneumonia," Evelyn replied tersely. "Help me get these wet things off before he catches his death." By the time Dr. Morrison arrived an hour later, Julian was installed in his bed, wrapped in warming blankets, but the violent shivering had given way to an ominous stillness. The physician's examination was thorough and his expression grave. "Pneumonia, as you suspected, Your Grace," he said quietly to Evelyn. "The next 48 hours will be critical. He must be kept warm, given willow bark tea for the fever, and watched constantly." "I shall tend him myself," Evelyn declared. Mrs. Price's eyebrows rose. "Your Grace, there are servants who can sit with His Grace." "I said I shall tend him," Evelyn repeated, her tone brooking no argument. For 2 days and nights, Evelyn barely left Julian's side. She bathed his fevered brow with cool cloths, coaxed spoonfuls of broth between his cracked lips, and changed sweat-soaked linens with the efficiency born of years managing her father's household through similar crises. The Duke was not an easy patient. Even in delirium he fought her ministrations, muttering incoherently about ledgers and obligations. On the second night, his fever reached its peak. Evelyn sat beside the bed, monitoring each labored breath, when suddenly Julian's eyes flew open, unfocused and wild. "Father!" he gasped, reaching out with one trembling hand. I tried to save it all, the estates, the name, everything you built. But Uncle Pembroke, he destroyed it, piece by piece, and I was too young to stop him." Evelyn caught his hand, feeling the burning heat of his skin. "Hush now, you must rest." But Julian seemed not to hear her. 16 years old when they died, mother first, then father 3 days later. The fever took them both, and Uncle looked at me across their graves and smiled. He smiled because he finally had control of everything. His voice broke, and Evelyn felt something crack inside her chest. "You are not 16 anymore," she said softly. "You have saved the estates. The worst is behind you now." "So alone," Julian whispered, his eyes finally focusing on her face. "Always so alone." Before Evelyn could respond, he slipped back into restless sleep. She sat holding his hand through the remainder of that long night, listening to his breathing gradually ease, feeling the fever slowly break. Dawn found her still at her post, exhausted but relieved. Dr. Morrison arrived with the morning light and pronounced the crisis past, though he cautioned that recovery would be slow. "You have done well, Your Grace," the physician said, genuine admiration in his voice. His Grace is fortunate to have a wife so devoted. Evelyn said nothing, too weary to correct the assumption behind those words. Julian woke properly that afternoon, weak but lucid. His gaze found Evelyn immediately where she sat dozing in the chair beside his bed. "You stayed," he said, his voice hoarse from disuse. Evelyn straightened, smoothing her rumpled gown self-consciously. "Someone had to ensure you did not expire and leave me with all these ledgers to manage alone." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Ever practical, Duchess?" "One of us must be," she replied, but her tone was gentler than usual. "How do you feel?" "As though I have been trampled by horses," Julian admitted. "Dr. Morrison tells me you tended me yourself through the worst of it." "Mrs. Price assisted," Evelyn said, avoiding his searching gaze. "You were quite insistent during your delirium. Something about ledgers and obligations." Julian closed his eyes briefly. "I spoke of other things as well, I suspect. Fever often loosens tongues," Evelyn agreed neutrally, offering him a merciful escape from embarrassment. He regarded her thoughtfully, something shifting in his expression. "You might have let the servants manage my care. This arrangement of ours does not require such personal sacrifice. You are my husband," Evelyn said simply. "Arrangement or not, I would hardly leave you to die of neglect." Before he could respond, a commotion in the corridor announced an unexpected arrival. Lady Margaret Whitmore swept into the room with the imperious authority of a woman accustomed to command, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of the scene before her. "Grandmother," Julian said, attempting to sit up and failing. "Lie still, you foolish boy," Lady Margaret commanded, crossing to the bed. "I received word yesterday that you had taken ill and came immediately." Her gaze shifted to Evelyn. "And you must be the new Duchess. We were not properly introduced at the wedding." Evelyn curtsied as well as her exhaustion allowed. "Your Grace, forgive the circumstances of our meeting." "Nothing to forgive. You appear to have kept my grandson alive, which is more than I expected from a hastily arranged marriage of convenience." The dowager's tone was acerbic, but her eyes held a calculating intelligence. "Now leave us. I wish to speak with Julian privately, and you look ready to collapse. Mrs. Price will show you to your chambers." Too tired to argue, Evelyn obeyed, but she had scarcely slept an hour when a knock roused her. Mrs. Price stood in the doorway, looking unusually hesitant. "Her Grace the Dowager wishes to see you, ma'am." In the west drawing room, Lady Margaret awaited her there, seated beside the fire with a leather-bound book in her lap. She gestured Evelyn to the opposite chair without preamble. "Julian tells me you have been managing the household and estate accounts with considerable skill," the Dowager began. "He also tells me you have asked nothing for yourself beyond the authority to fulfill those duties." "That was our agreement," Evelyn replied simply. "Agreements." Lady Margaret's expression turned sardonic. "My generation understood such practical arrangements well. But I wonder if you understand what you have married into, child. My grandson is not merely distant by nature. He has been systematically taught to distrust affection, to view emotion as weakness. His parents died when he was 16, Evelyn said quietly. He mentioned it during his fever." "Ah," the Dowager nodded. "Then you know something of it. But not all." She held up the book. "These are the diaries of Julian's mother, my daughter Caroline. I want you to have them." Evelyn blinked in surprise. "Your Grace, I could not possibly." "You can, and you will," Lady Margaret interrupted firmly. "Caroline was my only child, and she died far too young. But she left these behind, and I believe she would want Julian's wife to understand what shaped him." She pressed the volume into Evelyn's hands. "Read them. Learn what that monster Pembroke did to a grieving boy. Perhaps then you will have the patience my grandson requires, whether this marriage was one of convenience or not." After the Dowager departed, Evelyn retreated to her chambers and opened the diary with trembling fingers. Caroline Whitmore's elegant script filled page after page with observations about her young son, his cleverness, his sensitivity, his deep capacity for love carefully hidden behind reserve learned from his stern father. The final entries, written as illness ravaged the household, broke Evelyn's heart. "My darling Julian," one passage read, "if you read this someday, know that I loved you beyond measure. Your father, too, though he showed it poorly. Do not let Pembroke's bitterness poison your heart. You are capable of such love, my son. Do not fear it. But Pembroke had poisoned him, through years of calculated cruelty, masked as proper guardianship. The diaries made clear what Julian's fevered words had hinted at. Systematic emotional neglect designed to break a sensitive boy's spirit and create a cold, controllable air. That evening, for the first time since the wedding, Evelyn requested permission to dine with Julian in his chambers. He was sitting up against pillows, color returning to his face, when she entered. "I have been reading your mother's diaries," she said without preamble. "Your grandmother gave them to me." Julian's expression shuddered immediately. "Did she? She thought I should understand," Evelyn continued, taking the chair beside his bed. "Understand what you endured, what was done to you. Ancient history," Julian said dismissively. "It has no bearing on our present arrangement." "Does it not?" Evelyn challenged gently. "You spoke during your fever of being alone, of trying to save everything your father built while your uncle destroyed it." Julian looked away, jaw tightening. "Fever speaks nonsense. Sometimes fever speaks truth," Evelyn countered. She hesitated, then added, "My own father drank himself into near ruin after my mother died. I spent 8 years watching him destroy everything she loved, powerless to stop him until it was almost too late. I understand something of helplessness, Your Grace, and of the walls we build to survive it." For a long moment, silence stretched between them. Then Julian spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why did you accept my proposal? The truth this time." "Because my brother deserved better than poverty and disgrace," Evelyn replied honestly. "Because Carlisle Manor holds every memory I have of my mother. Because I was 6 and 20 with no prospects and no illusions about romantic love. Your arrangement offered purpose and security." That seemed enough. "And now?" Julian asked, his blue-gray eyes finally meeting hers. "Do you regret it?" Evelyn considered the question carefully. "I regret that we are both prisoners of circumstance, but I do not regret preventing your ruin, nor securing my family's future. Do you regret it?" "I regret," Julian said slowly, "that I have given you so little consideration beyond your utility in managing my affairs. You deserved better than that." It was perhaps the most honest thing either of them had said since their wedding day. Evelyn felt something shift between them, some small crack in the careful walls they had both constructed. "We have time yet," she said softly, "to determine what this marriage might become beyond its original purpose." Julian reached out tentatively, and Evelyn placed her hand in his. His grip was weak from illness, but unmistakably present. "Thank you," he said, "for staying, for—" He trailed off, but the gratitude in his eyes spoke volumes. Evelyn nodded, her throat suddenly tight. She withdrew her hand gently after a moment, aware they had ventured into dangerous territory. "Rest now," she said, rising. "You still have much recovering to do." As she returned to her own chambers, Evelyn found another letter from Peter waiting. But she also found correspondence from London, bearing Edmund Fairmont's distinctive seal. Inside was a society newspaper with several passages marked in ink. "The hasty marriage of the Duke of Hargrave continues to perplex society," one article read. "The new Duchess has been conspicuously absent from London gatherings, leading to speculation about the true nature of this union. Some suggest financial desperation drove both parties to an arrangement more practical than passionate." Evelyn crumpled the paper in her fist. Edmund's campaign of whispers had begun in earnest. She would need to be prepared for what came next. But tonight she had glimpsed something in Julian's eyes that gave her unexpected hope. Perhaps their arrangement might evolve into something neither of them had dared anticipate. Perhaps it already had. Spring arrived at Hargrave Hall with a subtlety that caught Evelyn by surprise. One morning she woke to find the gardens transformed, pale green shoots pushing through the soil she had ordered replanted, cherry blossoms drifting past her window on a mild breeze. The estate that had seemed so forbidding in winter's grip now revealed itself capable of beauty. Julian's recovery from pneumonia had been slow but steady, and something between them had shifted during those fevered nights when pretense fell away. He no longer avoided her quite so studiously. and their conversations at breakfast gradually expanded beyond estate business to include observations about the weather, inquiries about her correspondence with Peter, even the occasional debate about books they had both read. "Your brother writes that he is excelling in his mathematics courses," Julian remarked one morning, setting aside the letter Evelyn had shared with him. "Cambridge is fortunate to have him." "He is fortunate to be there," Evelyn replied quietly. "Without this arrangement between us, let us not dwell on what might have been," Julian interrupted gently. "The arrangement has proven beneficial to us both, has it not?" Their eyes met across the breakfast table, and Evelyn felt that now familiar flutter in her chest that she refused to name. "Indeed it has." The morning rides began by accident. Evelyn had taken to walking the grounds at dawn, examining the progress of various improvements, when Julian appeared one day astride his black gelding, leading a gentle mare. "Mrs. Price mentioned you rise early," he said without preamble. "I thought you might prefer to survey the estate on horseback rather than on foot." Thus began a ritual that neither acknowledged but both anticipated. Each morning they rode out together, sometimes in silence, sometimes discussing tenant concerns or planned renovations. Julian proved an excellent guide, pointing out landmarks and sharing anecdotes about the estate's history that revealed his deep attachment to the land his ancestors had held for generations. "My father used to bring me to this ridge when I was a boy," he said one morning, pausing at a vantage point that overlooked the valley. "He said a man who understands his land understands his duty." "He sounds like a wise man," Evelyn observed. "He was," Julian replied, something wistful crossing his features. "Stern, but not unkind. I wish I had known him better before the fever took him." Evelyn reached out impulsively and touched his sleeve. "I'm sorry." Julian looked down at her gloved hand on his arm, then back to her face. "Thank you," he said softly, and did not pull away. By late April, the estate's financial situation had improved dramatically. The fraudulent contracts had been replaced with fair agreements, the tenant cottages repaired, and several previously unprofitable ventures restructured. When Evelyn suggested reviving the annual beneficent ball for the tenants and local gentry, a tradition abandoned during Lord Pembroke's tenure, Julian agreed with surprising readiness. "It will require significant expenditure," he cautioned. "We can afford it now," Evelyn countered, "and the goodwill it generates will be worth far more than the cost." The preparations consumed a fortnight. Mrs. Price coordinated the household staff. The ballroom was thoroughly cleaned and redecorated, and invitations were dispatched to every respectable family within 20 miles. Evelyn found herself caught up in details she had never imagined managing: seating arrangements, menu selections, musicians to be hired. The night of the ball arrived with perfect weather. Evelyn dressed with particular care in a gown of deep emerald silk that Mrs. Price insisted brought out the color of her eyes. As she descended the grand staircase, she found Julian waiting in the entrance hall, resplendent in formal evening attire. He looked up as she approached, and something flashed in his eyes that made her breath catch. "You look quite lovely, Duchess." It was the first compliment he had ever paid her appearance. "Thank you, Your Grace." The ballroom filled rapidly with guests, tenant farmers in their best clothing mingling somewhat awkwardly with local gentry. Evelyn moved through the crowd, ensuring everyone felt welcomed, accepting congratulations on the estate's visible improvements with modest grace. "The Duchess has transformed Hargrave Hall," she overheard one farmer tell his wife. "His Grace is blessed to have found such a capable lady." When the dancing began, Julian appeared at her elbow. "I believe tradition requires the Duke and Duchess to open the ball." Evelyn's heart hammered as he led her onto the floor. It was the first time they had danced since their wedding, the first time he had touched her beyond courteous formality in weeks. As the music began and his hand settled at her waist, she was acutely aware of the warmth of his palm through the silk of her gown, the solid strength of his shoulder beneath her gloved fingers. "You have done well this evening," Julian murmured as they moved through the steps of the waltz. "The estate has not seen such celebration in many years." "I had considerable assistance," Evelyn replied, struggling to keep her voice steady. "Mrs. Price deserves most of the credit." "I was not speaking only of tonight," Julian said, his blue-gray eyes intent on her face. "You have accomplished more in these months than I dared hope when we made our agreement." That was our arrangement, Evelyn managed, though his proximity was doing strange things to her composure. I fulfill my duties, you fulfill yours. And if I find myself wishing our arrangement might evolve into something more? Julian asked quietly. Before Evelyn could respond to this astonishing statement, a commotion at the ballroom entrance drew their attention. A messenger stood there, road dusty and urgent, speaking to Mrs. Price, who immediately began scanning the crowd. The music faltered as Julian released Evelyn and strode toward the disturbance. Evelyn followed, dread pooling in her stomach. "Forgive the intrusion, Your Grace," the messenger said, bowing hastily. "I bear urgent news from Carlisle Manor. The Earl is gravely ill and not expected to survive. Miss Carlisle's presence is requested immediately." Evelyn felt the world tilt slightly. Her father, for all his faults, was still her father. "I must go at once." "We will go," Julian corrected, his voice brooking no argument. "Mrs. Price, please see that our guests are informed and the ball continues. Have my carriage prepared immediately." Within the hour, they were traveling through the night toward Carlisle Manor. The journey that had seemed interminable when Evelyn first came to Hargrave Hall now passed in tense silence, broken only by Julian's occasional inquiries about her comfort. Dawn was breaking when they arrived at the manor house that had been Evelyn's childhood home. The property showed signs of recovery under the capable administrator she had hired. The gardens no longer overgrown, fresh paint visible on the shutters. But the atmosphere inside was somber. Her father lay in his bedchamber, diminished by illness and excess, barely recognizable as the handsome man who had once commanded a room with his presence. The physician attending him shook his head grimly. "His liver is failing," he explained to Evelyn in low tones. "It is only a matter of time now." Evelyn sat at her father's bedside, holding his fevered hand while Julian stood respectfully near the window. The Earl drifted in and out of consciousness, occasionally murmuring names from the past, mostly his late wife's. In a moment of lucidity, his eyes focused on Evelyn. "My girl," he rasped, "I failed you, failed all of you." "Hush now," Evelyn said, though her throat was tight. "You need to rest. Your mother would be ashamed of what I became," he continued weakly. "But you saved us. You were stronger than I ever was." He slipped away before sunset, his last breath a quiet exhalation that seemed to take all the tension from his body. Evelyn sat frozen, unable to process the complicated grief of losing a father she had loved despite his failures. Julian's hand came to rest on her shoulder. "Come," he said gently. "There is nothing more to be done here tonight." The funeral was held 3 days later, a small affair attended mostly by local families who remembered better times. Peter arrived from Cambridge, taller and more mature than when Evelyn had last seen him, his young face grave with sorrow. "Sister," he embraced her tightly. "I came as soon as I received word." "I am glad you are here," Evelyn replied, then turned to make introductions. "Peter, this is my husband, the Duke of Hargrave. Julian, my brother, Viscount Carlisle." The two men regarded each other with mutual assessment before Peter bowed. "Your Grace, I must thank you for everything you have done for my family." "Your sister deserves the credit," Julian replied. "I merely provided opportunity. She has done the rest through her own considerable capability." After the funeral, as they prepared to return to Hargrave Hall, Peter drew Evelyn aside. "He seems a good man, your Duke. Are you happy?" Evelyn considered the question carefully. "I am content, and perhaps that is more than I expected." "You deserve more than contentment," Peter said fiercely. "You deserve someone who appreciates what a remarkable woman you are." "Perhaps he does," Evelyn admitted softly, thinking of Julian's words during their interrupted dance. "I am only beginning to discover it myself." The journey back to Hargrave Hall felt different somehow. Julian was solicitous of her grief without being overbearing, offering quiet companionship rather than empty platitudes. When exhaustion finally claimed her and she dozed against his shoulder, he did not shift away but instead adjusted his position to support her more comfortably. They arrived home to find Lady Margaret in residence, having come to visit during their absence. "I heard about the Earl," she said, embracing Evelyn with surprising warmth. "My condolences, child. Death is never easy, even when the deceased made it difficult to love them." Over tea the following afternoon, the dowager observed the subtle changes between her grandson and his wife with shrewd eyes. "You have done well with the estate," she remarked to Evelyn. "But more importantly, you have done well with Julian. I see a softness in him that has been absent for many years." "I have only fulfilled our agreement," Evelyn protested. "Agreements can become something more," Lady Margaret said knowingly, "if both parties are willing to let them." That evening, as Evelyn stood at her window watching the last light fade from the sky, she reflected on how much had changed since that cold morning in Mr. Hutchinson's office. She had gained a title, a purpose, even a kind of partnership with the remote man she had married, but she had also gained something far more dangerous and unexpected. She had begun to care for Julian Whitmore, to hope that his own barriers might crumble as hers had, to imagine their arrangement transforming into something neither had dared contemplate. Whether that hope would prove folly or fulfillment remained to be seen. The financial records spread across Julian's desk told a story of remarkable transformation. 6 months had passed since Evelyn's father's funeral, and the numbers no longer inspired dread, but cautious optimism. The primary debts that had threatened to destroy the Hargrave legacy were satisfied, the estate accounts balanced, and for the first time in Julian's tenure as Duke, there was capital enough to consider improvements rather than merely staving off disaster. "We have done well," Julian remarked, studying the latest quarterly report Evelyn had prepared. They stood side by side in his study, their proximity no longer awkward but natural, developed through countless hours working together over ledgers and correspondence. "We have survived," Evelyn corrected gently. "There is still much to accomplish." "Ever the pragmatist," Julian said, and there was warmth in his voice that had not existed in their early days. "Though I confess I hoped you might allow yourself a moment of satisfaction." Before Evelyn could respond, Mrs. Price appeared at the door. "Your Grace, this arrived from London." She held out an elegant envelope sealed with the Dowager Duchess's distinctive crest. The letter from Lady Margaret was characteristically direct. "The season approaches, and London society expects to see the Duke and Duchess of Hargrave properly established. You cannot hide in the countryside forever. Come to town. Show them what you have both become." Julian read the missive over Evelyn's shoulder, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him at her back. "She is not wrong," he said quietly. "We have avoided society long enough. It is time we took our place among the ton as a united front." Evelyn felt apprehension coil in her stomach. The prospect of facing London's scrutiny, of being examined and judged by women who had spent their lives perfecting the art of social warfare, filled her with doubt. "I am hardly equipped to be a duchess in such company. I have no experience with high society. You are the most capable woman I have ever known," Julian replied, his voice carrying an intensity that made her breath catch. "London society will recognize that, or answer to me." The journey to London took place in late May, when the season was at its height. They took residence in the Hargrave townhouse on Grosvenor Square, a magnificent property that had been kept in mothballs during Julian's years of financial struggle. Mrs. Price had sent servants ahead to prepare it, and when they arrived, the house gleamed with fresh polish and care. To Evelyn's surprise, Julian had arranged for a modiste to attend her immediately upon their arrival. "You will need appropriate gowns for the season," he explained when she protested the expense. "I will not have my wife appear in anything less than the finest fashion." The modiste, Madame Rousseau, was a stern Frenchwoman with exacting standards who spent 2 hours taking measurements and sketching designs. When she finally departed, Evelyn felt overwhelmed by the array of silks and laces that would soon comprise her new wardrobe. "This is too much," she told Julian that evening as they dined together. "The expense can be afforded," Julian interrupted firmly. "Thanks to your management, we are no longer on the edge of ruin. Allow me this, Evelyn. Allow me to provide for you as I should have from the beginning." There was something in his gaze that silenced her protests, something that looked dangerously close to tenderness. Their first significant social engagement was Lady Pemberton's ball, an event that drew the cream of London society. Evelyn, dressed with trembling hands in a gown of midnight blue silk that made her eyes appear luminous, her chestnut hair arranged in an elaborate style that the lady's maid had spent an hour perfecting. When she descended the stairs to where Julian waited in the entrance hall, His reaction was gratifyingly immediate. His eyes widened, traveling the length of her with undisguised appreciation. "You are magnificent," he said, his voice rough. The ballroom was ablaze with candlelight and crowded with the most fashionable members of society. Evelyn felt dozens of curious gazes fix upon them as they were announced, heard the immediate whisper of speculation that followed their entrance. "The Duke of Hargrave and his purchased bride," someone murmured nearby, the words clearly meant to be overheard. Julian's hand tightened on Evelyn's arm. But before he could respond, Lady Pemberton herself swept forward. "Your Graces, what a delight to have you with us this evening. The Duke and Duchess of Hargrave grace us with their presence so rarely that we are doubly honored." The formalities of greeting their hostess provided temporary refuge, but Evelyn remained acutely aware of the scrutiny they commanded. Several young gentlemen approached to request dances, and to her surprise, Julian approved each with barely concealed reluctance. Lord Markham, a handsome viscount with easy manners, led her onto the floor for a country dance. "You have been quite the mystery, Your Grace," he remarked as they moved through the figures. "London society has been consumed with speculation about the Duke's sudden marriage." "How tiresome for London society," Evelyn replied with practiced civility. "Surely they have more important matters to occupy their thoughts." "You underestimate your own interest," Markham countered with a charming smile. "A duke who has refused every matrimonial overture for years suddenly marries a woman nobody has heard of. It is the stuff of Gothic novels." Evelyn managed a thin smile and was relieved when the dance ended. But her relief was short-lived, for she immediately found herself claimed by Sir Thomas Weatherby for the next set. From his position near the refreshment table, Julian watched his wife move through the dancers with growing irritation. She handled the attention with grace. But the way these men looked at her, the familiar manner in which they spoke to her, set his teeth on edge. "Your wife is quite popular this evening," Edmund Fairmont observed, appearing at Julian's elbow with a glass of champagne. "How fortunate that she has found such warm welcome in society, despite the unusual circumstances of your marriage." "What do you want, Edmund?" Julian asked curtly. "Merely to congratulate you, cousin. Though I confess, the rumors persist. Some say the marriage remains unconsummated, that you married solely for financial gain and maintain separate lives." Edmund's smile was poisonous. "One can hardly blame society for speculating when you hide in the country for months on end." Julian's hand clenched around his own glass. "I suggest you guard your tongue regarding my wife." "Oh, I mean no disrespect," Edmund said smoothly. "I merely relay what others whisper. But perhaps you might demonstrate your devotion more publicly. Unless, of course, the whispers contain truth." Before Julian could respond, a commotion near the dance floor drew his attention. Lady Arabella Thornton, a notorious gossip known for her cutting remarks, had cornered Evelyn near the terrace doors. "My dear Duchess," Lady Arabella's voice carried across the suddenly quiet ballroom. "How clever of you to secure such an advantageous match. Tell me, what is it like to be a duchess bought and paid for? Does the title compensate for the lack of genuine affection?" The room fell silent. Every eye turned toward Evelyn, waiting to see how she would respond to such a blatant insult. Evelyn lifted her chin, her voice steady despite the humiliation burning through her. "I believe, Lady Arabella, that genuine affection cannot be purchased. Unlike certain other commodities that seem to dominate your concerns." Before Lady Arabella could rally, Julian was there, his presence commanding immediate attention. "You will apologize to my wife," he said, his voice carrying across the ballroom with the authority of generations of ducal power. Lady Arabella blanched. "Your Grace, I merely—" "You insulted the Duchess of Hargrave," Julian interrupted, his expression glacial. "My wife, who has proven herself a woman of extraordinary capability, intelligence, and grace. She has transformed Hargrave from near ruin to prosperity through her own skill. She has earned her title 1,000 times over through dedication and competence that would shame most of the empty-headed ornaments who populate London ballrooms." The silence was absolute. Julian's hand found Evelyn's, his fingers lacing through hers in a gesture that shocked the assembled company with its intimacy. "Let me be perfectly clear to everyone present," Julian continued, his gaze sweeping the ballroom. "The Duchess of Hargrave is my wife in every sense. She has my complete respect, my unwavering support, and anyone who questions her position or her worth will answer to me personally. Is that understood?" Lady Arabella managed a stammered apology before fleeing the ballroom in disgrace. Gradually, conversation resumed, but Evelyn could feel the shift in atmosphere. Where before there had been speculation and barely concealed contempt, now there was cautious respect tinged with fascination. Julian led her onto the floor as the orchestra struck up a waltz. As they moved together, Evelyn was acutely conscious of his hand at her waist, the warmth of his palm through her glove, the intensity with which he looked at her. "You did not need to defend me so fiercely," she murmured. "Yes, I did," Julian replied, his blue-gray eyes holding hers. "You are my wife, Evelyn. Not merely in name, but in truth." It is past time society understood that. The words spoken with such conviction made Evelyn's heart race. "Julian, no more pretense," he said quietly, for her ears alone. "No more keeping careful distance between us. These past months have taught me something I was too proud and too damaged to acknowledge before. You have become essential to me." Before Evelyn could respond, the music ended, but as Julian escorted her from the floor, she felt transformed. Something fundamental had shifted between them, acknowledged publicly in a way that could not be taken back. The remainder of the evening passed in a blur of introductions and conversations that now carried undertones of genuine respect. When they finally returned home in the early hours of morning, Evelyn found a letter waiting from Peter. "Dearest sister," he had written, "I am overjoyed to inform you that I shall graduate from Cambridge next month with highest honors. More importantly, I am prepared to assume full management of Carlisle Manor as we discussed. Thanks to your sacrifice and wisdom, the Carlisle legacy is secure. I hope your Duke appreciates what a treasure he has gained in you. Your devoted brother, Peter." Evelyn pressed the letter to her chest, overwhelmed by the enormity of what had transpired. Her brother's future was assured, Carlisle Manor restored, and somehow, impossibly, her arranged marriage was transforming into something that felt remarkably like love. Julian found her there, still in her ball gown, tears streaming down her face. Without hesitation, he crossed to her and pulled her into his arms. "What troubles you?" he asked gently. "Nothing troubles me," Evelyn replied, her voice muffled against his chest. "For the first time in years, everything is as it should be." Julian tilted her face up to his thumb brushing away her tears. "Not quite everything," he said softly, "but I intend to remedy that very soon." The promise in his words sent warmth flooding through her. Their arrangement had become something neither had anticipated, something far more precious than financial security or social position. It had become the foundation for a love that neither had dared hope for when they first struck their practical bargain in Mr. Hutchinson's office. The return to Hargrave Hall brought with it a sense of homecoming that Evelyn had not anticipated. London's glittering society, for all its newfound acceptance, had been exhausting. The countryside welcomed them with late summer warmth, the estate flourishing under the improvements they had implemented together. Something had fundamentally shifted between them since Lady Pemberton's ball. Julian no longer retreated to his study immediately after meals, instead lingering over port while Evelyn sipped her tea, their conversations stretching late into the evening. They discussed everything from estate matters to books they had read, politics to philosophy, discovering layers in each other that their initial arrangement had not permitted them to explore. "I have been thinking," Julian said one evening as they sat in the library, the space that had become their shared sanctuary, "about expanding the tenant school you proposed. With the harvest profits, we could afford to hire a proper teacher." Evelyn looked up from the correspondence she had been reviewing, warmed by his use of we, rather than the distant I that had characterized his speech in their early months. "That would be wonderful. Mrs. Price mentioned several of the tenant children show remarkable aptitude." Julian moved from his chair to sit beside her on the settee, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. "You have transformed this estate, Evelyn, not merely through financial management, but through genuine care for the people who depend upon it. We transformed it together," Evelyn corrected softly. His hand found hers, fingers intertwining in a gesture that still sent shivers through her despite its growing familiarity. "I find myself reluctant to share you, even with estate business. Is that terribly selfish?" Before Evelyn could respond, the sound of a carriage on the gravel drive interrupted them. Julian's expression darkened as he moved to the window. "Edmund," he said grimly. "I did not invite him." Edmund Fairmont swept into the drawing room minutes later with his characteristic false bonhomie, carrying a leather portfolio that he set down with theatrical flourish. "Cousin Duchess, forgive my unannounced arrival, but I bring extraordinary news that could not wait for correspondence." "What is it, Edmund?" Julian asked, his tone cool. "An investment opportunity of unprecedented magnitude," Edmund replied, spreading papers across the table. "A shipping venture to the Orient. The returns could triple your recovered capital within 2 years." Julian's interest was clearly piqued despite his distrust of his cousin. For the next hour, Edmund outlined the proposal with impressive detail, complete with projected profits and testimonials from supposedly reputable merchants. "I shall need time to review these documents," Julian said finally. "Of course," Edmund agreed smoothly. "Though I must emphasize that other investors are expressing interest. Speed is essential." After Edmund departed for the guest chambers, Evelyn approached the papers with the careful scrutiny she had developed through months of untangling Hargrave's financial morass. Something about the proposal troubled her, though she could not immediately identify what. "You are frowning," Julian observed. "What concerns you?" "I am not certain yet," Evelyn replied, examining a particularly detailed contract. "But these profit projections seem extraordinarily optimistic. And several of these merchant names." She paused, a memory surfacing. "Julian, do you still have your uncle's old correspondence files?" They spent the remainder of the evening in the estate office, comparing Edmund's documents with Lord Pembroke's archived papers. As dawn broke, Evelyn discovered what she had been seeking. Identical language and contracts, the same merchant names that had appeared in fraudulent agreements from years past. "It is all fabricated," she said, exhaustion and anger making her voice shake. "These merchants do not exist. The shipping company is a fiction. Edmund constructed this entire scheme using your uncle's old fraud templates." Julian's face had gone white with fury. He learned from Pembroke. Or perhaps his eyes widened with terrible realization. He worked with Pembroke. Further investigation through the old ledgers revealed Edmund's signature on several documents as witness, dating back to when Julian was still at Cambridge, too young and too grief-stricken to notice his cousin's involvement in the systematic destruction of the Hargrave fortune. When Edmund appeared for breakfast, Julian was waiting with the evidence spread before him. "I believe we need to discuss your investment proposal," Julian said, his voice deadly calm. "Or rather, your attempted fraud." Edmund's composure cracked immediately. "Julian, I can explain." "Explain how you conspired with my uncle to destroy my inheritance," Julian interrupted, rising to his full imposing height. "Explain how you sabotaged investments, arranged fraudulent contracts, all while pretending concern for the family welfare." "Uncle Pembroke promised me a share," Edmund said, abandoning pretense. "He said if the estate failed completely, if you were forced to sell, we would profit from the ruins. But you survived. You always survived no matter what we did. And when Uncle died, you continued his work," Evelyn added quietly, hoping to finish what he started. Edmund's laugh was bitter. "I underestimated you, Duchess. I thought you were merely a desperate spinster who had trapped a duke through financial necessity. I never imagined you would prove so capable." "You will leave Hargrave Hall within the hour," Julian commanded. "I am banishing you from all Hargrave properties permanently. Be grateful I do not have you arrested for fraud and attempted theft." "You cannot prove any of this," Edmund blustered. "I can prove enough to destroy your reputation," Julian replied, "and I have friends in Parliament who would be very interested in reviewing these documents. Now get out of my sight before I forget I am a gentleman." After Edmund's hasty departure, Julian sank into a chair, his hands trembling with suppressed rage. Evelyn knelt beside him, taking his hands in hers. "He is gone," she said softly. "He can hurt you no more." Julian pulled her up and into his arms, holding her with desperate intensity. "You saved me again, not merely the estate but me. Do you understand what you have given me, Evelyn? Hope, purpose, something I thought lost forever when my parents died. You have given me the same," Evelyn whispered against his chest. Julian drew back, his hands framing her face with reverent care. "I have been a coward," he said, his blue-gray eyes intense, hiding behind our arrangement, maintaining distance because I feared becoming vulnerable again. But I cannot continue this pretense. What pretense? Evelyn asked, though her heart was racing. That this is merely an arrangement. That you are merely my wife in name. His thumb brushed across her cheekbone. You have become everything to me, Evelyn. My partner, my companion. The woman I think of upon waking and dream of through the night. I love you. I should have said it weeks ago, months ago perhaps, but I was too damaged and too proud. Tears spilled down Evelyn's cheeks. I love you as well. I think I have for some time, though I dared not acknowledge it. Julian kissed her then, gently at first, then with growing passion as years of restraint finally shattered. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, he rested his forehead against hers. Come with me, he said, taking her hand. He led her through the darkened corridors to the gardens, where moonlight silvered the roses and the fountain splashed softly. The same gardens she had ordered restored months ago, now blooming with life. The night we married, I told you we would maintain separate lives, Julian said. I release you from that arrangement. I ask instead for a true marriage, not of convenience or necessity, but of choice and love. Yes, Evelyn replied simply. Yes to all of it. They returned to the house hand in hand, climbing the stairs together for the first time. Julian paused outside Evelyn's chambers, suddenly uncertain. I do not wish to pressure you, he began, but Evelyn silenced him with a kiss. I am your wife, she said firmly. Not merely in name, but in truth. I want this, Julian. I want you. What followed was tender and unhurried, the culmination of months of growing intimacy and trust. Julian proved as attentive and careful in love as he had been reserved in their early acquaintance, and Evelyn discovered that passion built slowly could burn far brighter than instant attraction ever could. Later, as they lay entwined in the darkness, Julian traced patterns on her shoulder. I was wrong about so many things, he murmured, about what marriage could be, about what I deserved, about you. We were both wrong, Evelyn replied. We thought we were making a practical arrangement. We did not realize we were making a beginning. The best beginning, Julian agreed, pressing a kiss to her temple. Thank you for your patience with me, for seeing past the walls I constructed. Thank you for letting me in, Evelyn whispered. They fell asleep wrapped in each other's arms, their marriage of convenience finally transformed into the love match neither had dared to hope for. Outside, the summer night deepened toward autumn, and at Hargrave Hall, two people who had been alone too long had finally found their home in each other. 1 year had passed since that moonlit night when Julian and Evelyn had finally acknowledged the love that had grown between them. Hargrave Hall had been transformed not merely in its physical state, but in its very atmosphere. Laughter echoed through corridors that had once known only silence, and the estate flourished under the devoted stewardship of a duke and duchess who ruled as true partners in every sense. Evelyn stood at the window of their shared bedchamber, one hand resting on the slight swell of her abdomen where their child grew. 3 months along, and still the wonder of it had not faded. Julian came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and pressing a kiss to her temple. You are thinking too loudly again, he murmured. I can hear it from across the room. I am thinking how remarkable it is, Evelyn replied, leaning back against his solid warmth. A year ago, we were barely more than strangers bound by contract. Now you carry my air, and I cannot imagine a single day without you. Julian finished. Yes, it is rather remarkable, though I prefer to think of it as inevitable. We were always meant for this, Evelyn. We simply required time to discover it. A knock at the door interrupted their moment. Mrs. Price entered with her customary efficiency, carrying a silver salver bearing several letters. The Morning Post, Your Graces, and may I say, the household is delighted about the forthcoming arrival. Thank you, Mrs. Price, Evelyn said warmly. She had long since earned the housekeeper's genuine affection, and the entire staff had celebrated when news of the pregnancy became known. Among the correspondence was a letter bearing Peter's familiar handwriting. Evelyn opened it eagerly, reading aloud for Julian's benefit. Dearest sister, I write with joyful news. I have successfully completed my examinations at Cambridge with highest honors, and I am prepared at last to assume full management of Carlisle Manor. Thanks to your wisdom and sacrifice, our family legacy is not merely preserved but thriving. I shall travel to Hargrave Hall next month to share this triumph with you in person. Your loving brother, Peter. Tears pricked Evelyn's eyes. He has done it. Everything we worked for, everything we sacrificed, it has all come to fruition. Julian squeezed her hand. He has done it because you gave him the chance. You saved your family, Evelyn, through courage and determination. I am honored to have played even a small part in that. You played far more than a small part, Evelyn replied, rising on her toes to kiss him. You gave me partnership when I expected only transaction. You gave me love when I had resigned myself to duty. Their peaceful morning was shattered by the arrival of another letter, this one bearing no sender's mark and sealed with common wax. Julian broke the seal and read the contents, his expression darkening with each line. What is it? Evelyn asked, alarmed by the fury building in his features. Julian handed her the letter wordlessly. The message was brief, but devastating. To His Grace the Duke of Hargrave, it has come to our attention that the fortune used to secure your marriage was obtained through criminal means. Lady Thornbury's wealth derived from illicit trade in contraband goods. Proof of these allegations will be presented to the proper authorities within a fortnight. Your marriage, based upon fraudulent capital, may be subject to annulment. Consider carefully whether maintaining this union is worth the scandal that will destroy the Hargrave name. The letter was unsigned, but its malicious intent was unmistakable. This is Edmund's work, Julian said, his voice tight with controlled rage. He has not finished his campaign of destruction. But my grandmother's fortune was legitimate, Evelyn protested, though fear coiled in her stomach. She invested in textile trade. There was nothing criminal about it. Truth matters little if lies are presented convincingly, Julian replied grimly. Edmund knows this. He is betting that the threat of scandal will force us apart. Over the following days, pressure mounted from unexpected quarters. Julian's solicitors counseled caution, suggesting that preemptive annulment might preserve the Hargrave reputation if Edmund's allegations proved convincing to the courts. Several of Julian's fellow peers, hearing whispers of impending scandal, sent carefully worded letters advising him to distance himself from his wife until the matter was resolved. Evelyn watched Julian weather this storm with growing despair. She knew what the Hargrave name meant to him, how deeply he felt the responsibility of his position. Late one night, she found him in his study, staring at documents spread across his desk. I have made a decision, she said quietly. Julian looked up, and the anguish in his eyes nearly broke her resolve. Evelyn, I will leave, she continued, forcing the words past the constriction in her throat. I will go to Carlisle Manor with Peter. The scandal will touch you less if I am gone. You can claim you discovered the fraud after our marriage and acted accordingly. Your reputation will survive. Absolutely not, Julian said, rising with such sudden force that his chair toppled backward. I will not entertain such a notion for even a moment. But the scandal. Damn the scandal, Julian interrupted fiercely. Damn my reputation. Damn the Hargrave name. Damn everything if it means losing you. He crossed to her, framing her face with trembling hands. Do you not understand yet? You are not the price I paid to save my estates. You are the reason those estates matter at all. Without you, they are merely stone and soil. With you, they are home. Julian, the child, is ours, he said firmly. Legitimate in every way that matters. I will not let Edmund's lies steal our happiness or our future. We will fight this together, Evelyn, as we have fought everything else. A letter from Peter arrived the following morning, sent express after he had somehow learned of the threat. Sister, I am traveling to Hargrave Hall immediately. Whatever forces conspire against you, you will not face them alone. The Carlisle family stands with the Duke of Hargrave. True to his word, Peter arrived within 2 days, now a confident young man of 20 who bore himself with the dignity of his title. He embraced Evelyn fiercely before turning to Julian with extended hand. Your Grace, my sister's battles are my battles. How may I assist? Together they began their investigation. Julian's connections in London provided access to banking records and shipping manifests. Peter, with the enthusiasm of youth and a Cambridge education in law, analyzed the documentation with meticulous care. Evelyn, despite Julian's protests about her condition, refused to be excluded, her keen eye for financial irregularities proving invaluable. The truth emerged gradually but unmistakably. Lady Thornbury had indeed made her fortune through textile investments, all documented, legal, and above reproach. The evidence Edmund planned to present consisted of expertly forged documents that placed her name on manifests for smuggled goods, documents that would appear authentic to casual examination. But Peter discovered the fatal flaw. "The paper," he said excitedly, holding one of Edmund's forgeries to the light. "This particular type of watermarked paper was not manufactured until 1815. These documents supposedly date from 1808. They are anachronistic. Can we prove it?" Julian asked. "We can," Peter confirmed. "I have a colleague at Cambridge whose father owns a paper mill. He can provide testimony about manufacturing dates and watermark patterns." Armed with this evidence and testimony from merchants who had known Lady Thornbury personally, they prepared their defense. But Edmund had already filed his accusations with the ecclesiastical court, forcing a formal hearing to determine the validity of the marriage. The night before the hearing, Evelyn could not sleep. She found Julian on the terrace, staring out over the moonlit gardens they had restored together. "Whatever happens tomorrow," she said, joining him, "I want you to know that this year with you has been worth any price." Julian pulled her close, his hand resting protectively over where their child grew. "Tomorrow, we win," he said with quiet conviction. "We have truth on our side, and we have each other. Edmund's lies cannot stand against that. I love you," Evelyn whispered. "I love you," Julian replied, "and I will spend the rest of my life proving it to you." As they stood together beneath the stars, Evelyn felt the fear that had gripped her heart finally begin to ease. They had faced ruin before and emerged stronger. They would face this final threat the same way, together, united, and unbreakable. Tomorrow would bring either vindication or disaster. But tonight, in Julian's arms, Evelyn allowed herself to hope that love and truth would prove stronger than malice and lies. The Chamber of Lords was austere and imposing, its wood-paneled walls bearing witness to centuries of judgments that had shaped England's aristocracy. Evelyn sat beside Julian, her hand clasped tightly in his, as Edmund Fairmont presented his case before the assembled ecclesiastical court and several peers who had been called to witness the proceedings. Edmund's solicitor, a sharp-featured man named Mr. Hargreaves, laid out the accusations with theatrical precision. "Gentlemen, we present irrefutable evidence that Lady Thornbury's fortune, upon which the Duchess of Hargrave's dowry was based, derived from criminal enterprise. These manifests clearly show her involvement in smuggling operations between 1808 and 1812. He spread documents across the table before the judges, each bearing what appeared to be Lady Thornbury's signature, alongside lists of contraband goods. The forgeries were expertly done, Evelyn had to admit, convincing enough to deceive anyone who did not look too closely. Furthermore, Hargreaves continued, "We contend that this marriage, contracted under false pretenses using criminally obtained funds, should be declared null and void under ecclesiastical law." Julian's hand tightened on Evelyn's as Edmund sat back with barely concealed satisfaction. Then Julian's own solicitor, the venerable Mr. Hutchinson, who had witnessed their wedding, rose to present their defense. "Your lordships, what we have witnessed is an elaborate fiction constructed by a man whose jealousy and greed have driven him to commit fraud himself in order to destroy the marriage of his cousin. Mr." Hutchinson gestured to Peter, who stepped forward with the paper expert they had brought from Cambridge. "This is Mr. Thomas Weatherby, whose family has manufactured fine papers for 3 generations, Mr. Hutchinson explained. "Mr. Weatherby, please examine the documents presented by the petitioner." Weatherby took up each manifest, holding them to the light, running his fingers across the surface with professional care. "These documents bear the Whitmore Mill watermark," he said clearly. "A distinctive pattern my father developed. However, this particular watermark was not introduced until 1815. These documents, supposedly dating from 1808 through 1812, could not possibly be authentic." A murmur ran through the chamber. Edmund's face paled visibly. Furthermore, Peter added, stepping forward with his own evidence, we have testimony from 3 merchants who conducted legitimate business with Lady Thornberry during the years in question. Each will attest that she invested solely in textile trade, all properly documented and taxed. We also have the original banking records from Coutts, showing every transaction tied to her investments. There is not a single irregular entry. One by one, the merchants testified, their accounts consistent and credible. The banker from Coutts presented ledgers that showed decades of legitimate business. The paper expert demonstrated conclusively that Edmund's documents were sophisticated forgeries, but forgeries nonetheless. Finally, Mr. Hutchinson addressed the court directly. Lord Edmund Fairmont has perpetrated a calculated fraud against this court and against his own family. His motive is transparent. As heir presumptive to the Hargrave dukedom, he has spent years attempting to destroy the Duke's fortune and reputation, hoping to inherit through his cousin's ruin. When the Duke married and began to recover his estates, Lord Edmund's schemes were threatened. This false accusation represents his final desperate attempt to tear apart a legitimate and loving marriage. The Chief Judge, Lord Pemberton, conferred quietly with his colleagues before speaking. Lord Edmund Fairmont, you have wasted this court's time with fabricated evidence and malicious accusations. We find your claims to be without merit and your conduct to be reprehensible. The marriage of the Duke and Duchess of Hargrave is hereby declared valid and inviolate. He fixed Edmund with a stern gaze. Furthermore, you are banned from presenting any future petitions to this court, and we strongly recommend that His Grace consider whether criminal charges for fraud and forgery might be appropriate. Edmund stood frozen, his carefully constructed scheme collapsing around him. Julian rose, his voice carrying the full weight of ducal authority. You are banished from all Hargrave properties, Edmund. You will retire to your holdings in Scotland and remain there under supervision. Be grateful I am showing even this much mercy. As Edmund was escorted from the chamber in disgrace, Evelyn felt tears of relief streaming down her face. Julian pulled her into his arms, heedless of the assembled witnesses. It is over, he whispered against her hair. Truly over. No one can threaten us now. The journey back to Hargrave Hall was triumphant. News of their vindication spread rapidly through society, and letters of congratulation arrived daily. But Evelyn and Julian paid little attention to the outside world, focused instead on preparing for the arrival of their child. On a crisp autumn morning, Evelyn gave birth to a healthy son. Julian was present despite the scandalous breach of convention, refusing to be anywhere but at his wife's side. When the midwife placed the squalling infant in his arms, tears coursed down the Duke's face. William Edward Whitmore, he said, gazing at his son with wonder. After my father and yours. Perfect, Evelyn whispered, exhausted but radiant. Peter arrived from Carlisle Manor the following week, now fully established as the estate's master, managing it with the same competence his sister had once shown. He held his nephew with awkward tenderness, marveling at how much had changed since that desperate day when Evelyn had agreed to marry a stranger to save their family. You have built something extraordinary here, Peter said, observing Julian's devoted attention to both wife and child. Not merely recovered estates, but a true home. Lady Margaret, visiting to meet her great-grandson, watched the scene with satisfaction. I knew from the beginning, she declared to Mrs. Price. That girl had steel in her spine, and my grandson needed someone who would not be cowed by his walls. They have saved each other. 6 months after William's birth, on a mild spring evening, Julian surprised Evelyn by leading her to the small chapel on the estate grounds. There, in the presence only of their closest loved ones, they renewed their vows. The first time we spoke these words, they were a contract, Julian said, his voice thick with emotion. Today, I speak them as a promise of my heart. I, Julian Edward Whitmore, take you, Evelyn Grace, as my wife, my partner, my greatest blessing. I vow to love you, honor you, and cherish you for all the days of my life. Evelyn's voice broke as she replied. I, Evelyn Grace, take you, Julian Edward, as my husband, my love, my home. What began as necessity has become the greatest gift I could have imagined. This time, when he kissed her, it was not as strangers bound by contract, but as partners bound by love. 2 years later, Evelyn stood in the garden, one hand on her swelling belly where their second child grew, watching Julian teach young William to toddle across the lawn. Peter visited regularly from Carlisle Manor, bringing news of its continued prosperity. Lady Margaret sat on a bench nearby, her aged face soft with contentment as she observed her great-grandson's antics. "Do you ever think about that first morning in Mr. Hutchinson's office?" Julian asked that evening as they prepared for bed, the comfortable intimacy of a true marriage now second nature to them both. "Sometimes," Evelyn admitted. "I remember thinking you looked at me as though I were a horse at auction." Julian laughed, pulling her close. "I was terrified," he confessed. "Terrified of needing anyone. Terrified of hoping for anything beyond survival. You were so calm, so composed. I thought you must be made of stone. And now I know you are made of something far stronger than stone. You are made of courage and compassion, and a love I never deserved, but will spend my life being worthy of." Evelyn kissed him tenderly. "We saved each other, Julian. The estates were never what mattered. Home is not a place but a person, and I found mine in you." As they lay together in the darkness, Evelyn reflected on the strange journey that had brought them here. They had married to save estates and fortunes, bound by desperation and necessity. But somewhere along the way, through shared struggles and growing trust, through vulnerability and patience, they had discovered something neither had sought but both desperately needed. They had found love not despite their arrangement, but because of it. They had learned that the strongest foundations are built not in passion's first flush, but in the quiet moments of partnership, the shared victories over adversity, the choice to see beyond walls to the wounded hearts beneath. The Duke had married her to save his estate, but in the end, she had become the only thing he could not bear to lose, and he had become hers in equal measure, proof that sometimes the most unexpected bargains yield the most precious treasures. May you, dear reader, find such fortune in your own life, and may you sleep peacefully tonight, knowing that love built slowly and tested thoroughly is a fortress that no force can breach.